This video is produced in order to introduce you to Swiss style or international style. The official name for this style is International Typographic Style, but most people either call it Swiss style or International style. It's called Swiss style because it happens first in Switzerland in the 1950s, where there's this push to focus on clarity and legibility. However, Switzerland is also the appropriate place for this because it's seen as being a very neutral style. It's not supposed to have any particular national association. This should remind you of right after World War I, when all of these different artists are trying to create a universal style that would communicate across national boundaries. Well, the stylistic strategies that they produced then deeply influence international style as it exists in the 1950s. This time around, it really takes off. So the styles that we're going to be looking at are heavily indebted to De Stijl and constructivism. However, all of the radical, politically engaged elements of those styles are completely removed. What we have instead is this neutral discourse of commercial communication. And so what we'll be looking at is how do these artists take the ideas of constructivism and De Stijl and dilute out everything that's political in order to create something that will feel very familiar to you, its corporate identity. I mentioned before that the official name for this movement is International Typographic Style, and that's because it really is rooted in typography. Specifically, these designers in Switzerland in the 1950s come upon Accidence Grotesque. This is a typeface first introduced in 1898. It's a sans serif. It fits very well in what we learned about in the 19th century. However, the Swiss designers look at this and they say, this is neutral. This almost disappears. It doesn't call attention to itself. And so they argue that Accidence Grotesque is the typeface that everybody should use. Now, because Accidence Grotesque is copyrighted, many different typefaces emerged during this decade that are so similar to it that they're almost interchangeable, but you don't have to pay to license them. Helvetica and Universe are examples of this. The style spreads because of journals like this one. This is New Graphic Design, Neue Grafik, and it explains all of the principles of this new typographic style and publishes it in multiple languages around Europe and the United States, and eventually in South America, Asia, and Africa as well. And it becomes international because people really like it and start integrating the styles in everything that they do. So let's talk about how this functions within posters. What we're looking at here on the left, this is a Beethoven poster by Josef Müller-Brockmann. This is really our iconic Swiss style poster because here we see the major stylistic elements. The first one is asymmetry. Notice that Müller-Brockmann doesn't put Beethoven in the middle. He puts it over here. It's off to the lower left. Grid regulation. This whole poster can be organized on a grid. So you can trace the lines of the grid systematically through each of these. So look at how the text here lines up with the lines. Look at how this lines up with the T of Beethoven. All of this suggests a very careful grid regulation. Flush left. So they argue that things shouldn't be centered, but rather they should be flush left. It's an easier way to read things, especially if your text moves from left to right anyway. And then finally, positive use of negative space. Look at the white space here. This is the negative space, right? It's empty, and yet it reads like the letter B for Beethoven. It could also read like piano keys because this is a pianist. It could also read like a concert hall. It's almost as if the text is on the stage and that empty negative space becomes the stage. So these are the key stylistic elements that we'll be tracing in Swiss style. Now, if you look, you can see that it's deeply indebted to L. Lissitzky and constructivism. I mean, when you put these next to each other, you can see that L. Lissitzky is also having positive use of negative space. That white circle on the right is just empty negative space. It's asymmetrical. The text kind of flies across the entire space of the composition. And yet, the Beethoven poster is so much more neutral. It doesn't have that same energy, right? It's something entirely different. And so it takes the stylistic strategies of constructivism, but then reshapes them for corporate means. Here's another example. This is by Hans Neuberg. This is an ad for bouillon cubes. And what Neuberg does here is something that we saw happening also in constructivism. So I've now brought up another L. Lissitzky. This is that creepy poster from the Russian exhibition at the Museum of Applied Arts in Zurich. Neuberg is working in Zurich, and so he's definitely familiar with this stuff. And both of them use photographs, superimpose text over photographs. However, whereas the L. Lissitzky is about Soviet gender equality and comes off as being like really intense and political, on the left, the Hans Neuberg is like, oh, look, that's a Swiss housewife wearing her apron and encouraging you to buy a bouillon cube. Again, we have asymmetry, flush left, the grid. I mean, like her apron is literally a grid. So all of those same rules are in effect. One last example. This is Armin Hofmann. This is an ad for the ballet Gazelle, and this is from Basel. The two examples that we looked at before are from Zurich, and Zurich's Swiss style is much more rigid. In Basel, they were a little bit more relaxed, and you can see that here. So Gazelle is printed in such a way that the Swiss would never have approved of, with the text going down like that. However, the way that Hofmann produces the text, it's almost as if that text Gazelle kind of imitates the ballerina. I really love the way the eye, the dot of the eye, kind of interacts with the ballerina's body. And then her knee comes into the negative space of Gazelle as well. And so what you see here is a very careful examination of text and photography working together. This, again, should remind you of the constructivists. But instead of the radical political content, we now have an ad for the ballet.